Today I'll be discussing with you the War of 1812. It is very important in historical context, not only for U.S. history, but British history as well, which is where I'll be discussing with you today. The War of 1812 itself lasted from June 18, 1812 to February 18th of 1815. There were two specific battles that were important in British perspective, those being the Battle of Queenston Heights, which happened in Canada, and the Battle of New Orleans, which took place in Louisiana. Now, after the Revolutionary War in 1783, there were about 30,000 people that wanted to claim land for themselves. So they would move up and travel up north to Canada. But the British told them, according to historian Alan Taylor, told them they could stay as long as they would swear to protect Canada for the British. Now, relations started deteriorating when Thomas Jefferson was elected President of the United States. The reason being is he had trade deals in place with the British and the French. Now, the reason this is so important is because the Napoleonic Wars were going on at this time, which was between the British and the French. So relations were deteriorating slowly, but it wouldn't completely deteriorate until James Madison was elected President of the United States, where he would cut off all ties with both the British and the French. Now, relations were deteriorating, but it wasn't completely cut off until Prime Minister Spencer Perceval was assassinated and Lord Liverpool would become the new Prime Minister. The reason being is he actually wanted to have full, complete control of all territories for the British. Now, he wanted to go to war, but James Madison wasn't necessarily wanting to go to war. But he stated to Congress that if they signed into law the War of 1812, that he would sign off on it. So with that being said, Congress passed it and he would sign the Declaration of War. Now, we'll start off with the Battle of Queenston Heights. Now, the British was coming off a huge advantage in capturing Detroit at that time, right before the battle. And the Americans flew to Canadian territory. They would settle there and set up for camp, but they would end up killing a rider in Montreal, which set off the Battle of Queenston Heights. But it would take some time because the British government was wanting to be on the defensive end of it rather than the offensive. But finally, it came into perspective that they needed to. So the Battle of Queenston Heights would take place. Now, according to historian John Latimer, the American general Stephen Rensselaer wanted the soldiers to cross the Niagara River where they could battle the British. But his soldiers were not okay with this, and they would decide not to, which would hurt them in the end because the British would go on the offensive and attack the Americans, where they would win the Battle of Queenston Heights. Now, in relevance, this is probably not necessarily important in U.S. history, but for the British it is. The reason being is they would be able to claim and keep their Canadian territory that they had already had, but it would also stop American expansion from happening. Now, there were other various battles between the Battle of Queenston Heights and the Battle of New Orleans, but not that were as impactful for the British, and they didn't have tremendous influence. Now, the next battle being the Battle of New Orleans, which was very important for the British. On Christmas Eve of 1814, the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium was signed between the United States and the British, ending the War of 1812. But there was a delay in them getting word back in the States before the Battle of New Orleans would take place. So with that being said, everybody thought they were still fighting for something, but in the end they weren't. So the Battle of New Orleans would start, and they would start fighting. Now, the Native Americans had previously helped the British in the War of 1812, so it came to a surprise when they decided they weren't helping them. So the British were on their own in this battle. Now, General Andrew Jackson heard the British were setting up in Pensacola, but he saved his soldiers because he didn't feel the necessity to send them to Pensacola. Now, the British tried to get pirates and smugglers as well, but the Americans actually arrested most of the pirates and smugglers for breaking laws of Constitution. Now, the British fought with what they had, although they were struggling very, very much so. Jackson would launch a full upscale attack on the British, although the British had an advantage with all the soldiers. Unfortunately, the Brits couldn't come victorious, and the Americans would end up coming victorious. They would cease fire and quit the battle because the Americans had won, but they also found out about the Treaty of Ghent. The Battle of Queenston Heights itself was good for the British because they were able to keep control of Canada, but it would be an undermise for the Battle of New Orleans because there were 2,500 casualties and it wasn't necessarily a war that needed to happen.